Cowboy married a 20-year-old black virgin, and neither of them knew what to do on their wedding night. The towering mountain man shifts awkwardly on the bed's edge while the trembling girl clutches her nightgown, both frozen in terrified silence. The townspeople had whispered he'd never find tenderness, destined to die alone on his failing ranch. They predicted she'd wither away as his burden, another mouth he couldn't afford to feed. What they didn't know was that behind her quiet demeanor lay a sharp mind that could save them both. If external forces didn't destroy their fragile union first. A smooth-talking businessman watches from the shadows, his railroad scheme depending on their marriage crumbling. Will two strangers discover love through vulnerability, or will manipulation tear apart what hasn't even begun? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The Wyoming wind cut through the gaps in the barn walls like a knife. Zeke Harrison stood among his dying cattle, counting losses he couldn't afford. 23 head lost to disease this month alone. The bank notice crumpled in his coat pocket reminded him of the impossible deadline looming ahead. His younger brother Thomas approached with hesitant steps. The letter in his hands trembled slightly as prairie dust swirled around them both. "Got a response," Thomas said quietly. Zeke looked up from the sick calf he'd been examining. "Response to what?" Thomas cleared his throat. "The arrangements I've been making. For your future." The words hit Zeke like a punch to the gut. His brother had been writing letters behind his back, correspondence with families back east. Desperate measures for desperate times. "You did what?" "The Washington family in Georgia. They have a daughter, 20 years old, educated. They need security for her future." Zeke stared at his brother in disbelief. Mail-order brides were for men who couldn't find wives any other way. Men who'd given up on normal courtship. Men like him, apparently. "We can't afford another mouth to feed." "We can't afford not to have help," Thomas replied. "The ranch is dying, Zeke. You know it as well as I do." 3 weeks later, the train whistle echoed across the valley. Zeke stood on the platform in his only clean shirt, watching passengers step down onto the wooden planks. His hands shook as he smoothed his hair back. Then he saw her. Magnolia Washington stepped carefully from the train car, her dark skin gleaming in the afternoon sun. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her eyes swept the crowd nervously before settling on him. The other passengers gave her a wide berth. Whispered comments followed in her wake. Zeke felt his cheeks burn with shame, though whether for her situation or his own, he couldn't say. "Miss Washington?" She nodded once. "Mr. Harrison." They stood facing each other in awkward silence. Neither knew what came next. The ride back to the ranch passed without conversation. Magnolia sat rigid in the wagon seat, her small trunk balanced behind them. Zeke stole glances at her profile, searching for clues about the woman who would become his wife in 2 days. The cabin looked smaller with her in it, more rundown. The gaps in the walls seemed wider, the furniture more worn. Magnolia set her trunk in the corner and surveyed her new home without expression. "It's not much," Zeke admitted. "It's honest work," she replied softly. The wedding took place in the town church 2 days later. A handful of curious onlookers filled the back pews, their whispers carrying across the small space. The preacher rushed through the ceremony like he had somewhere better to be. When he pronounced them husband and wife, neither moved to kiss. They simply stood there, two strangers bound by legal words and desperate circumstances. The ride home felt longer this time. The sun had set by the time they reached the cabin. Thomas had made himself scarce, leaving them alone to figure out their new arrangement. Inside, the oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls. Magnolia had changed into her nightgown, a simple white cotton dress that made her look even younger. Zeke still wore his wedding clothes, afraid to move or speak. They sat on opposite edges of the narrow bed like it might collapse under shared weight. The silence stretched between them, heavy with expectation and fear. Zeke had worked with horses and cattle his entire life. He understood their needs, their behaviors, their fears. but this woman beside him might as well have been from another world entirely. "I don't know what you expect," he finally managed. Magnolia's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know either." Neither had been prepared for this moment. No mother had explained the mysteries of marriage to either of them. No father had offered guidance about intimacy or companionship. They were as lost as two people could be. Hours passed. The lamp burned lower. Eventually, exhaustion overtook awkwardness, and they fell asleep, fully clothed, backs turned to each other, the vast distance of 2 feet between them feeling like miles. Morning brought the harsh reality of their situation into focus. Creditors would be back soon. The cattle still needed tending. The ranch still teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. And now Zeke had a wife who expected things he didn't know how to provide. He found her in the kitchen, attempting to make breakfast from their meager supplies. She moved efficiently despite being unfamiliar with the space, her hands steady as she worked. "The coffee's strong," she said without looking at him. "I like it strong." It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. Thomas returned that afternoon, his eyes avoiding both of them as he mumbled something about checking the north pasture. His guilt hung around him like a visible cloud, though Zeke couldn't understand why his brother seemed more nervous now than before the wedding. What none of them knew was that a man named Samuel Whitmore sat in the hotel in town, making notes about railroad routes and property values. His plan was already in motion, and the success of this awkward marriage threatened everything he'd worked toward. The stakes were higher than any of them realized. More than just a failing ranch hung in the balance. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding. Zeke and Magnolia moved around each other like polite strangers sharing a boarding house room. He left before dawn to tend cattle. She cleaned and cooked in silence. They ate meals without conversation. The morning everything changed, started like any other. Zeke sat at the kitchen table staring at a stack of papers with growing frustration. Numbers swam before his eyes like foreign symbols. His reading had always been poor, but contracts made his head spin. "The cattle buyer comes today," he muttered. Magnolia glanced up from washing dishes. She'd noticed these papers before. Legal documents scattered everywhere, most bearing signatures that seemed to favor everyone except her husband. A knock at the door interrupted the morning quiet. Jebediah Mills stood on the porch, his expensive suit and calculating smile making Zeke's stomach turn. The cattle buyer had been dealing with the Harrison Ranch for 5 years, and somehow Zeke always walked away feeling cheated. "Morning, Zeke. Ready to discuss this month's sale?" They spread the contract across the kitchen table. Mills spoke quickly, pointing to various clauses and calculations. His finger moved across terms like market adjustments and transportation deductions, while Zeke nodded along, lost. Magnolia continued washing dishes, but her ears caught every word. The numbers Mills quoted didn't match the figures she could see on the document, not even close. "Sign here," Mills said, sliding the paper toward Zeke. "Same terms as always." Zeke reached for the pen. His wife's hand suddenly covered his. "May I see that?" Magnolia asked quietly. Mills looked annoyed. "This is business, ma'am." "I understand business," she replied, her voice steady. Zeke hesitated, then slid the contract toward her. Magnolia's eyes moved quickly across the page, her finger following lines of text. Her expression grew darker with each paragraph. "This calculation is wrong," she said finally. Mills laughed. "I doubt that, girl. The base price shows $12 per head, but your deductions total $8 per animal. That leaves $4 per cow." "Market conditions," Mills said dismissively. "Market conditions don't justify 60% deductions, especially when transportation costs are listed separately." The room fell silent. Zeke stared at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. She read the contract like she'd been born understanding legal documents. "Furthermore," Magnolia continued, "this clause allows you to adjust final payment based on weight estimates, not actual measurements. You could claim the cattle weighed anything you wanted." Mills's face had turned red. "Now, see here. I see perfectly well. You've been systematically cheating my husband for years." Zeke felt the world shift beneath him. His wife, the quiet woman who barely spoke at meals, was dismantling a business contract with surgical precision. "Where did you learn to read contracts?" he asked. "Georgia," she said simply. "I worked for a family with legal interests. You pick things up." Mills gathered his papers quickly. "I'll take my business elsewhere." "Please do," Magnolia replied. After Mills left, Zeke sat in stunned silence. His wife moved around the kitchen like nothing extraordinary had happened, but everything had changed. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Known what?" "That I can't read properly." She stopped moving, turned to face him. Her expression was gentle, not pitying. "Since the first day. You hold papers like they might bite you." Heat rushed to his face. His own wife had seen through him immediately, while he'd spent years pretending competence. "I can read some," he said defensively. "Just not the complicated parts. That's all they use in contracts, the complicated parts." Over the following days, Magnolia quietly began organizing Zeke's chaotic paperwork. Bills stuffed in drawers emerged in neat piles. Contracts were sorted by date and importance. She worked while he was out with the cattle, transforming his office from disaster to efficiency. What she discovered made her stomach turn. Every business dealing for the past 5 years showed the same pattern: inflated fees, hidden deductions, clauses that benefited everyone except Zeke. He'd been systematically robbed by men who counted on his reading difficulties. But buried in the legal chaos, she found something else. Property deeds that revealed the true extent of Harrison land holdings, mineral rights that had never been explored, water rights that were worth a fortune in this dry country. Zeke Harrison wasn't a poor rancher struggling to survive. He was a wealthy landowner who didn't know his own worth. The next cattle buyer who approached got a very different reception. Magnolia stood beside her husband during negotiations, quietly correcting calculations and questioning contract terms. The buyer tried to intimidate her with legal jargon, but she responded in kind. They walked away with triple the payment Zeke usually received. "How did you know all that?" Zeke asked later. "I told you. I picked things up in Georgia." But there was more to the story. In Georgia, she'd worked as a seamstress for Judge Morrison's family. While stitching clothes, she'd listened to legal discussions. While cleaning the study, she'd read law books meant for the judge's sons. While serving meals, she'd absorbed conversations about contracts and property rights. Learning had been survival. Knowledge had been her only weapon against a world determined to keep her powerless. Now that knowledge was transforming their lives. Within a month, the ranch's finances completely turned around. Bills got paid. Creditors stopped threatening. Zeke walked taller, spoke with more confidence. But something else was changing too. The quiet, frightened woman who'd stepped off the train was disappearing. In her place stood someone who met challenges head-on, someone who was just getting started. The ranch was thriving, but Magnolia felt restless. Success with the contracts had awakened something in her, a hunger for purpose beyond organizing papers and cooking meals. She found herself staring at the town from their porch, wondering what lay beyond the familiar boundaries of their property. "I want to start a bakery," she announced one morning. Zeke looked up from his coffee, surprised. "In town?" "The old Murphy building is empty. Mrs. Chen mentioned it needs a tenant. People in town aren't exactly welcoming. They'll come around if the bread is good enough." Within a week, she'd rented the small storefront. The building smelled of dust and abandonment, but Magnolia saw potential in its bones. High ceilings, good light, space for ovens and display cases. She worked 16-hour days transforming the space, scrubbing floors, painting walls, installing shelves built from ranch lumber. Zeke helped when he could, but the cattle still needed tending. Her first customer was Catherine Mills, the widow who owned the general store. The woman approached cautiously, drawn by the smell of fresh bread wafting onto Main Street. "What kind of bread is that?" Catherine asked. "Honey wheat. My grandmother's recipe." Catherine bought 2 loaves, returned the next day for more. Word spread slowly through the network of women who ran the town's households. The bakery opened officially on a Tuesday morning. 5 customers came that first day, 10 the second. By the end of the week, Magnolia had a steady stream of buyers seeking her breads, pies, and pastries. Never tasted anything like this, Catherine admitted. You've got a gift. More than a gift. Magnolia had learned baking from her mother, who'd learned from enslaved cooks who'd perfected their craft in plantation kitchens. Techniques passed down through generations of women who'd made the best of limited ingredients. The bakery became more than a business. Women gathered there to share news, exchange recipes, discuss their families. Magnolia listened more than she spoke, but her quiet presence created a space where conversations flowed freely. Zeke noticed the changes in his wife. She moved with new confidence, spoke with authority about her business plans. The frightened girl from the train station had completely disappeared, but her success made him uncomfortable. Townspeople praised Magnolia's baking while treating him the same as always. His wife was becoming the more respected half of their marriage. He started spending longer hours on the range, came home later each evening, found reasons to avoid the bakery when he came to town for supplies. The distance between them grew wider, even as their individual lives improved. Then Samuel Whitmore arrived. He stepped off the morning train wearing a tailored suit and carrying expensive luggage. His credentials identified him as a railroad development specialist from Denver. His smile suggested he brought prosperity to whatever town was lucky enough to host him. Samuel rented the hotel's finest room, bought drinks for prominent citizens, spoke knowledgeably about economic opportunities and modern progress. Within days, he'd positioned himself as the answer to everyone's prayers. He visited the bakery on his third day in town. "Magnificent," he said after tasting Magnolia's apple tart. "You've created something remarkable here." "Thank you." "Have you considered expanding? A talent like yours shouldn't be confined to one small establishment." No one had ever called her talented before. No one had suggested she might be capable of bigger things. Samuel returned every morning for coffee and conversation. He'd traveled extensively, read widely, spoke eloquently about art and literature and current events, topics Magnolia had only dreamed of discussing. "You're remarkably well informed," he observed during one of their talks. "I read when I can find books." "What kinds of books?" "Anything. Legal texts, poetry, philosophy, whatever comes my way." Samuel's eyes lit up. Here was an educated woman trapped in circumstances far beneath her capabilities, a mind hungry for intellectual stimulation. He began bringing her books from his personal collection, volumes of Shakespeare, treatises on economics, collections of contemporary poetry. They discussed literature over morning coffee while other customers listened in amazement. Zeke heard about these conversations secondhand. His wife was discussing subjects he couldn't even pronounce with a man who represented everything he wasn't: educated, sophisticated, worldly. The jealousy started as a small knot in his stomach, grew larger each time someone mentioned how much Samuel enjoyed talking with Magnolia, fed on his own insecurities about education and refinement. "That railroad man seems quite taken with your wife," Thomas mentioned casually. "They're just talking." "Lot of talking for a married woman." Zeke began finding excuses to visit town during Samuel's morning visits to the bakery. He'd stand across the street, watching them through the window, seeing her animated expression, her engaged posture, her obvious pleasure in the conversation. She never looked that interested when talking to him. The confrontation came on a Friday evening. Zeke had watched Samuel and Magnolia discuss books for over an hour, their heads bent close together over pages of text. His patience finally snapped. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked when he entered the bakery. Magnolia looked up, startled. "Zeke, I didn't expect you." "Apparently not." His eyes fixed on Samuel. "Don't you have business to conduct somewhere?" Samuel smiled smoothly. "Just appreciating fine literature with someone who understands it. My wife has work to do." "Your wife has a remarkable mind. It would be a shame to waste it on menial tasks." The words hit like a physical blow. Menial tasks, like running a ranch, like the life Zeke provided. "Maybe you should worry about your own business," Zeke said. "Perhaps I should." That night, the silence between Zeke and Magnolia felt different, heavier, filled with unspoken accusations and hurt feelings. "He's just being friendly," she said finally. Friendly men don't bring married women gifts. They're books, Zeke, not jewelry. Same thing to him. What's that supposed to mean? It means he's trying to impress you. And it's working. The fight that followed was their first real argument. Years of unexpressed frustration poured out in harsh words and painful accusations. She called him jealous and controlling. He called her naive and ungrateful. Both said things they immediately regretted. But in the aftermath, something shifted. For the first time since their wedding night, they were completely honest with each other. And honesty, it turned out, was the foundation everything else would build on. The fight left wounds that wouldn't heal quickly. Zeke slept in the barn for 3 nights running. Magnolia threw herself into bakery work with desperate intensity. They moved around their shared life like strangers again, but this time, the silence carried weight. Thomas watched his brother's misery with growing guilt. The young man had been acting strange for weeks, jumping at unexpected sounds, avoiding certain topics of conversation. Dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights. On the 4th morning after the fight, Thomas found Zeke mending fence posts with unnecessary violence. Each hammer blow seemed designed to punish the wood for existing. "This has gone far enough," Thomas said quietly. "Stay out of it." "I can't stay out of it. Not anymore." Zeke looked up from his work. Something in his brother's voice made him set down the hammer. "There's something you need to know about your marriage," Thomas continued, "about how it really came to be." "I know how it came to be. You arranged it." "No." Thomas took a shaky breath. "I didn't arrange anything. Someone else did." The words hung between them like a physical presence. Zeke felt the world shift slightly, the way it did before a storm. "What are you talking about?" "Samuel Whitmore. He's the one who contacted me, months before Magnolia ever arrived." Zeke's blood turned cold. "That's impossible." "He knew about our debt, knew about the land, knew exactly how desperate we were." Thomas pulled a crumpled letter from his coat pocket. The paper was worn, from handling, creased from being folded and refolded countless times. Zeke recognized the guilt in his brother's hands. "Read it," Thomas said. But Zeke couldn't read the complex handwriting. Thomas had forgotten his brother's limitations even in confession. "Tell me what it says." Thomas cleared his throat. "It says Samuel needs our land for a railroad route, but he can't buy it directly because of some legal complications with the territory government. So? So he needed another way to get it. He figured if your marriage failed, you'd lose the ranch to creditors. Then he could buy it cheap from the bank." The implications hit Zeke like a physical blow. His marriage, his wife's displacement from Georgia, everything had been orchestrated by the same man who now brought her books and engaged her in scholarly conversation. "He paid you," Zeke said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded miserably. $500. I thought we'd lose the ranch anyway. I thought at least this way you'd have a wife when it happened. You sold me. I thought I was saving us both." Zeke grabbed his brother by the shirt front. Fury and betrayal warred in his chest, but underneath both emotions lay something worse. Fear. "Does she know?" "I don't think so. But Samuel's getting impatient. He expected the marriage to fall apart by now. Instead, it succeeded. Better than succeeded. You're both thriving. That's not what he planned." Zeke released his brother and stepped back. The pieces of a larger puzzle were falling into place. Samuel's sudden interest in Magnolia wasn't romantic. It was strategic. "He's trying to break us up. The books, the conversations, making you jealous, it's all calculated." Rage built in Zeke's chest, but it was clean anger now, focused. He'd been manipulated, but so had Magnolia. They were both victims of the same scheme. "Where's the rest of his correspondence?" "Hidden in my room. Letters, payment receipts, the whole plan." "Get them." While Thomas retrieved the evidence, Zeke's mind raced through recent events with new understanding. Samuel's timing, his interest in Magnolia's intelligence, his subtle comments about wasted potential. Every interaction had been designed to drive wedges between husband and wife. Thomas returned with a small wooden box filled with papers. Letters in Samuel's handwriting detailed the entire scheme. Payments to Thomas, correspondence with associates about railroad routes, maps showing the Harrison property as a crucial link in a larger development plan. Most damning of all was a letter dated just 3 days earlier. "What does that one say?" Zeke asked. Thomas read aloud. "The marriage has proven more resilient than anticipated. The woman shows unexpected intelligence, and the man unexpected adaptability. More direct intervention may be required to achieve desired outcome." Direct intervention. He's planning something else. Zeke studied the documents he couldn't read, but now understood completely. His marriage had been a business transaction from the beginning, but not in the way he'd thought. Someone else had written the terms. "We have to tell Magnolia. She'll never forgive us. She might forgive us. She'll never forgive being lied to." They found her at the bakery, kneading bread dough with the same fierce concentration she applied to everything else. She looked up when they entered, her expression guarded. "We need to talk," Zeke said. She wiped flour from her hands and followed them to the back room. Thomas spread the letters across her work table while Zeke watched her face. "Can you read this?" he asked, pointing to Samuel's handwriting. Magnolia bent over the papers. Her expression changed as she absorbed the contents. Surprise gave way to understanding, then to cold fury. He arranged everything. From the beginning. My family's situation, your debt, even the timing of my arrival. All of it. She stood quietly for a long moment, processing the betrayal. When she finally spoke, her voice was deadly calm. "What does he gain if we fail?" "The land, for his railroad." "And if we succeed?" "He loses everything he's invested in this scheme." Magnolia looked between the two brothers, her husband, who'd been played as much as she had, his brother, who'd been bought with their shared desperation. "Then we succeed," she said simply. "Together?" "Together." The word carried weight it had never held before. Not just a marriage of convenience or financial necessity, but a partnership forged in the fire of shared betrayal. They had an enemy now, but for the first time since their wedding night, they also had each other. The revelation changed everything between them. That evening, Zeke and Magnolia sat at their kitchen table not as awkward strangers, but as allies planning war. The letters spread before them told a story of manipulation that made their forced marriage seem like destiny by comparison. "He underestimated us," Magnolia said, studying Samuel's correspondence. "Look at these assumptions." She pointed to a particular passage Thomas had read aloud. Samuel's letters described Zeke as barely literate, and Magnolia as compliant and grateful. His plan had depended on their weaknesses. "He didn't count on your intelligence," Zeke said, "or your integrity." It was the first compliment they'd ever exchanged. Simple words, but they carried the weight of genuine recognition. Over the next 3 days, they developed their counter-strategy. Magnolia's legal knowledge proved invaluable as she identified flaws in Samuel's property acquisition scheme. Zeke's understanding of local politics helped them identify allies. Catherine Mills became their first recruit. The widow listened to their evidence with growing indignation, her face darkening as the scope of Samuel's deception became clear. "He bought me dinner twice," she said, asked all sorts of questions about property, values, and local business owners. "He's been gathering intelligence on everyone," Magnolia explained. "What do you need from me?" "Names, other people he might have approached." Catherine's network of female friendships proved extensive. Within 2 days, she'd identified 6 other business owners who'd received Samuel's attention. All had been questioned about finances, family situations, and property holdings. The pattern was clear. Samuel hadn't just targeted the Harrison Ranch. He'd been mapping vulnerabilities throughout the entire community. "We need to warn them," Zeke said. "More than that," Magnolia replied. "We need to unite them." The town meeting took place in the church on Sunday evening. 23 people gathered to hear evidence of Samuel's schemes. Thomas brought the letters and financial records. Magnolia presented the legal analysis. Zeke spoke about the personal cost of manipulation. The reaction was swift and angry. Samuel had wooed half the town while planning to exploit their weaknesses. Business owners who'd trusted him with sensitive information felt personally betrayed. "What do we do about it?" asked the blacksmith. "We expose him," Magnolia said. "Publicly. Make it impossible for him to operate here. And then? We make sure he never tries this anywhere else." The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Samuel would be invited to present his railroad development proposal at the next town council meeting, a public forum where he'd expect admiration and support. Instead, he'd face a united community armed with evidence of his deception. But Samuel wasn't finished with his own manipulations. As word of the planned confrontation spread, he made one final desperate attempt to salvage his scheme. He visited the bakery alone on Wednesday morning, arriving before other customers. His usual charm had been replaced by something harder. "I hear there's been some misunderstanding about my business here," he said. Magnolia continued kneading bread without looking up. "No misunderstanding. Perfect clarity." "I think you're making a mistake. Your husband is a good man, but he can't give you the life you deserve." "What life do I deserve?" "Education, culture, intellectual stimulation. I could provide those things." She finally looked at him directly. "In exchange for what?" "Your happiness. And a fair purchase price for property that's going to be worthless anyway." "Worthless?" "The railroad will be built with or without this community's cooperation. Property values will collapse if you fight the inevitable." Samuel's mask had finally slipped completely. No more pretense about literature or friendship, just naked economic threat. "Are you finished?" Magnolia asked calmly. "I'm offering you a chance at a real life. I have a real life. With my husband. On our land." Samuel's expression turned ugly. "Your husband is a fool who can barely read his own name." "My husband is an honest man, who builds rather than destroys. Honesty doesn't pay debts. Neither does theft." Samuel left without buying anything. His final words carried the weight of threat. This isn't over. But it was over. The community had united against him, and his schemes had been exposed. All that remained was the public confrontation. The town council meeting drew the largest crowd in memory. Samuel arrived expecting a friendly audience for his development presentation. Instead, he faced hostile stares from people who knew exactly what he'd been planning. Thomas stood first, reading selected passages from Samuel's letters. The crowd's murmur grew angrier with each revelation. Catherine Mills followed with testimony about his intelligence gathering. Other business owners shared their experiences. Finally, Magnolia rose to present the legal analysis. She'd prepared carefully, organizing the evidence into an undeniable case of attempted fraud. "Samuel Whitmore came here not as a developer but as a predator," she concluded. "His railroad exists only on paper. His investment capital is borrowed against properties he doesn't own. His entire scheme depends on acquiring our land through manipulation and lies." Samuel tried to respond, but the crowd wouldn't let him speak. Shouts of anger drowned out his attempts at explanation. The sheriff escorted him from the building for his own protection. Within a week, Samuel had left town permanently. His creditors followed shortly after, seeking repayment for investments in a railroad route that would never be built. The victory belonged to everyone, but Zeke and Magnolia had led the fight. Their marriage, born from deception, had become the foundation for community resistance. More importantly, they'd discovered something neither had expected. In fighting for their partnership, they'd found genuine affection. That night, as they sat together reviewing the legal documents that secured their future, Zeke reached for his wife's hand. She didn't pull away. For the first time since their wedding night, touching felt natural rather than obligatory. 6 months passed like a different lifetime. The Harrison Ranch had transformed from struggling operation to thriving enterprise. Cattle grazed in healthy herds across expanded pastures. New buildings dotted the property. The main house had been enlarged and properly weatherproofed, but the most remarkable change was between Zeke and Magnolia themselves. They worked as true partners now. He handled the physical demands of ranching while she managed the business side. Every major decision was made together. Every success was shared between them. The bakery had become the social heart of town. Women gathered there not just for bread, but for Magnolia's quiet wisdom and practical advice. She'd begun teaching reading lessons to children whose parents couldn't afford formal schooling. Respect had replaced suspicion in the townspeople's attitudes. The woman who'd arrived, as an unwanted stranger, was now an essential part of the community fabric. On a warm spring morning, Magnolia made an announcement that changed everything again. "I'm with child." Zeke stopped brushing his horse and turned to stare at her. Joy and terror warred across his features. "Are you sure? Catherine confirmed it yesterday. The baby should come in late fall." This time, the news brought excitement instead of fear. They'd chosen each other through crisis and partnership. A child would be the product of genuine love, not obligation. Thomas had redeemed himself through months of hard work and honesty. His guilt over Samuel's manipulation had transformed him into a more thoughtful man. He threw himself into ranch improvements with dedication that impressed everyone. "You'll need help with the baby," he said. "I can hire additional hands for the cattle work." "We'll manage," Zeke replied. "We always do." The pregnancy brought them even closer together. Zeke read aloud every evening, his literacy improving through Magnolia's patient teaching. She'd found books about child rearing and proper nutrition. They planned for their future with the confidence of people who'd overcome impossible odds. Magnolia continued working at the bakery until her condition made standing difficult. Catherine and other women took turns helping, ensuring the business continued operating smoothly. "You've built something special here," Catherine observed one afternoon. "We all built it together." "Don't be modest. This town is better because you came here." As autumn arrived, so did their daughter. The birth took place at home with Catherine serving as midwife. Zeke paced the kitchen while women's voices murmured behind the bedroom door. When the baby's cry finally broke the silence, his legs nearly gave out from relief. "Come meet your daughter," Magnolia called softly. He entered the bedroom to find his wife propped against pillows, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. The baby had Magnolia's delicate features and his own dark hair. "What should we call her?" he asked. "I was thinking Josephine. Josie for short." Josephine Harrison. He tested the name and found it perfect. "She'll be smarter than both of us. She'll have better opportunities than either of us had." That became their shared mission, creating opportunities for their daughter that hadn't existed for them. Education, choices, the freedom to become whatever she wanted. Over the following years, their family grew in every sense. 2 more children followed Josephine. The ranch expanded to include neighboring properties purchased from families moving east. The bakery spawned a restaurant that served travelers on the territorial road. Zeke learned to read complex documents through necessity and Magnolia's teaching. She developed a reputation for business acumen that drew consultation requests from throughout the territory. Their marriage had become the foundation for everything else they built. Partnership in the truest sense, where individual strengths combined to create something larger than the sum of its parts. Thomas married Catherine's niece and started his own small spread adjacent to the main ranch. His children played with Josephine and her siblings, creating the large family none of the adults had experienced in childhood. The community that had once viewed their marriage with suspicion now held it up as an example. Other arranged marriages followed their pattern of mutual respect and shared responsibility. On a summer evening in their 10th year together, Zeke and Magnolia sat on their expanded porch watching their children play in the yard. Josephine, now 9, was teaching her younger brother to read. Their baby daughter napped in Magnolia's arms. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Zeke asked. "Which part? How terrified we were. How certain we were that we'd made a terrible mistake." Magnolia shifted the sleeping baby and leaned against her husband's shoulder. "We did make mistakes. Just not the one we thought." "What do you mean?" "We thought marriage was supposed to be easy. That love was something that happened to you instead of something you built. And now? Now I know better. Love isn't a feeling that strikes like lightning. It's a choice you make every day. Zeke kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair mixed with baby soap and the bread she'd been baking. Best choice I ever made. We made it together. As the sun set over their thriving ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they watched their children run through grass that belonged to them, land they'd fought to keep, a future they'd built from nothing but determination and trust. The frightened strangers who'd shared a wedding bed a decade earlier had become partners in the deepest sense, not just husband and wife, but co-architects of a life neither could have imagined alone. Their love story had begun with ignorance and fear, but it had grown into something magnificent through patience, honesty, and the courage to choose each other again and again. In the distance, the train whistle echoed across the valley, carrying new passengers toward unknown destinations. Some would find what they were seeking. Others would have to build it themselves. Zeke and Magnolia Harrison had done both.